a little bit entertaining. However, talking about a refinery could be a little bit dry subject. But my name is Steve Lang. I work at the Holly Frontier Refinery up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. We have 5 refineries. We're mostly a mid-con refinery. We've got them in Kansas, Utah, Nebraska. Sorry, not Nebraska. Kansas, Utah, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Wyoming. And I'm the refinery manager, or the refinery operations manager up there. So I'm in charge of all the stuff we're going to talk about today. All those processes, trying to make sure that from the feedstocks that are purchased to where we're making on-spec product out of the back end and making a saleable product for our customers. So you guys got some questions here. If somehow I miss something on here, hit me up. If somebody sees a question, raise a hand, ask a question, I'm good. We can break this up however. I got 40 slides here. Don't know if we'll get through all of them. Some of the ones at the end are mostly government regulation type stuff, so that's even a little less entertaining than hopefully the rest of this. My quick background is grew up down in Denver area. Went to school at Arvada West. Went to college up in South Dakota at School of Mines up there. Engineering degree. Took a first job down in Louisiana, so I went to go work for Mobil down in Louisiana. We decided that wanted to raise our family up here, so we moved back to northern Colorado, and I've had one son graduated from Rocky, and then I've had my other 3 kids have graduated. Well, 2 have graduated from Windsor, and we're hoping Eli gets through. So he's our last one. So with that, if anybody, you guys ever heard the term refinery before? So Western Sugar, they've got refineries, right? So their refinery is trying to make sugar. They're refining a base stock and turning it into a product that everybody can use. So an oil refinery, we're kind of that piece in the middle. There's companies that pull the oil out of the ground, there's companies that refine it, and then there's marketing sales branches out the back end. So our whole company is just working on that little middle piece to where we're taking the crude out of the ground. We run it through certain processes to make it the specs that we want, and then that makes the saleable product out of the back end. So with that, here's kind of stuff we're going to go over. We're going to talk about the whole refinery, kind of the industry, the specifics for the refinery, products, processes. I'll get into some of the profitability pieces, and then RINs is that government piece, and that's kind of a piece that you can say, hey, it's not even our base business, but all of a sudden it's impacting our business. So it's just kind of interesting information. So this slide is busy, but this is kind of what I was alluding to as far as you see tanks all around Windsor, right? Windsor's kind of been a hotbed for drilling lately. So you see those little crude gathering tanks. So as they're collecting the oil and gas out of the ground, it goes into those tanks, a truck will come and pick it up. Trucks come and deliver the crude to our refinery. A lot of the local trucks here go down to, there's a refinery in Denver, the Suncor refinery. Takes them down there. Crude can either come in to the refinery through trucks or pipelines, and then we'll bring it in. We run it through that refining process, and that's the detail that our whole business is kind of this little block right here. And then after that, they can end up, there's refineries that make jet fuel. We don't make jet fuel. The jet fuel down in Denver comes from the Denver refinery. Our refinery, we focus on mostly gasoline and diesel products. And then asphalt is also a big one for us. And you can see from the refinery, it goes into product terminals, and then it's sold out to the customer. So an interesting one for refineries is everybody's seen a Shell gas station or an Exxon gas station, or there's some Valeros around. So the idea that, hey, Exxon actually, they call themselves an integrated company. They pull the oil out of the ground, they refine it, and they market and sell it to the retailers out the back end. However, the one that's interesting is that all gasoline and diesel products, they're considered fungible. which fungible means everybody that refines a product, it all gets thrown into the same tank, and then the Exxons, the Shells, the Valeros, King Supers, they all can come and pull out of that same tank, and then they go sell it under their brand. So a lot of people have this misconception that gasoline, diesel can, hey, if it's an Exxon product, you know it's made by Exxon. Not true. Everybody puts their same gasoline into the tank. There's a government regulation that makes sure everybody's making the same specs, same qualities, and then out of that, where people differentiate their products are usually in their chemical additives programs that they put into their fuels, but all that's mandated by the government too, and so all of that pretty much acts the same. So that's kind of usually one that trips people up, is what comes out of there. It's all the same for all the refineries. We're all tied to the same government specs. So this is kind of what a refinery does. So when a barrel of crude comes out of the ground, it's made up of a whole bunch of different components. So naturally, we call it naphtha. There's 25% naphtha in there. There's usually a 20% diesel portion, and then we get to these heavier products. Gas oil. Gas oil on its own, it's really only saleable down to some of the ships can run it that are the big ocean liner ships, but in general, there's not a big market for that. And then the type of crude we run is a heavy crude that there's a lot of asphalt. So out the back end of ours crude unit, we end up making a lot of asphalt. So the way that our business, the way that we actually capture and try to make money is we buy a barrel of crude, and say if it's $100 barrel of crude, at the end of the day when we run it through our processes and we pay all our people and pay for the energy, this is the products we try to make out the back, because gasoline is more valuable than this, diesel is more valuable than this, and so hopefully out the back end the mixture that we sell is more valuable than what's on the front end. And that's how we stay in business. So this is a very busy slide. However, there's a couple of pieces from this so the local refineries around here, we're considered pretty small refineries. So for us to compete against the big ones, we usually have to be very cost competitive, try to buy the cheapest feedstocks, and fortunately Denver is a good market to sell into, and all up and down the whole Front Range. So we have a pretty captive market here. However, so over in India, South Korea, Olympics are getting ready to go on in South Korea. They have some of the biggest refineries in the world, 1 million barrels of processing right there. In the States, some of the big ones down here, these 500,000 to 600,000, that's a very big refinery for the United States. And then here's our business. Well, I'm working at this one. We do 52,000 barrels a day. So on a competitive advantage, I mean, I use a lot of the same number of people. My costs tend to be higher. So for us to stay competitive with these guys, we just say we have to really watch our business and make sure that we're staying profitable. But our company here, we say our total, we have about 450,000 barrels. So there's single refineries in the United States have as much processing capability as our whole company. So, crude. Everybody's heard the term crude. Everybody's heard fracking. Fracking is a way to try to maximize crude, right? Back in the old days, you could go drill a hole straight down in the ground, crude would come out. Up here, just the way that our formations are kind of set up is that if you go drill a hole straight down, not much comes out. So now they call it directional drilling, and they get to go run through wherever these layers are of the oil and gas deposit. Now they can go and directionally drill through them, and then to try to make these formations up here loosen up, that's where the term fracking comes on. So all of that happens 9,000 feet in the ground. So how far down is that? getting close to 2 miles, right? It's a long ways down to go try to get to these layers that were formed. So, I mean, this piece is from a long time ago, right? That all that stuff, it's a carbon-based product, and so that's what's sitting down there. Pieces that people talk about for crude oil is there's a term sweet crude and sour crude. Anybody guess why they called it sweet crude? Because down in Texas, when it would come out of the ground, they would taste it. And it actually had a sweet taste to it. Sounds pretty nasty, right? Don't recommend it, I wouldn't try it. The crude we run is sour crude. And the reason ours is sour is it's got a high sulfur content. So as anybody smells like propane tank, the mercaptan in there, that sulfury smell, rotten eggs, our crude, we call it sour because I would not taste it and it smells not very pleasant. The differentiation on that is about 0.5%. So at 0.5% lower, usually all those crudes are called sweet. And then anything more than that's sour. All sulfur does is it's a contaminant to finished products. And so you have to remove all that sulfur to be able to sell it. So you can buy, typically the sour crudes are cheaper, but there's a higher processing cost to be able to run those crudes. So you're trying to balance that whole piece of the business side. Other properties we look at are pour points. We're going to get into distillation. I think you guys were talking about distillation. Carbon residue. This is the piece that after you take a barrel of crude oil and if you were to cook it at 1,000 degrees and you cook it all the way down to dust, you see what's left. And that's a product that not a lot you can do with that, right? We call it coke, coming out of a refinery. A lot of people will blend it though with coal coming out of the mines, and then it goes to different kilns or furnaces and they'll burn it. Another one we watch is, we call it TAN, which is the total acid number. That's just a representation of how acidic the crude can be. And if you run that crude, it'll eat up all your pipes if you're not paying attention. So API gravity, you guys deal with that? So it's just a nice little formula. Everything's based on water at 10, right? So if a water gravity is base 10, does everybody know most oils, what do they do on water? Float, right? So gasoline's got a much lighter gravity, diesel's a little bit lighter. The crude we buy typically runs 20 to 25 gravity. So it's lighter than water. However, when we're refining it, the asphalt that comes out, asphalt's like a 5. So what does asphalt do in water? Sinks. So asphalt drops out. And it's all based on the gravity piece. And then I touched on this sweet sour, that 0.5% is just kind of a rough number, but literally it was guys tasting crude oil. Nasty. This is a piece I was talking about, is that is sulfur contents. As you get to a higher sulfur content, that's a cheaper crude. And then if you get out to gravities that are lighter, 40, that's a much lighter crude. Well, this and this doesn't take as much heat, energy, units to process, so it's cheaper to make gasoline. However, those are much more expensive crudes because they're easier to run. You get down here, and this is where we typically run our slates, is that we're trying to run the heaviest, nastiest crude around because we think it's the cheapest. And this kind of shows that West Texas Intermediate used to be a baseline crude. You'll hear it talked about in the news, WTI and Brent, that's just a marker crude, and then a lot of other stuff gets based on that. So if you just go from a 0.3 sulfur down to a 1.9, there's a $4 discount to buy that crude. And then here's one of our base crudes. We're at almost a 3.5% sulfur, and so we buy our crude at $39. So right away, I'm paying hopefully $14 less than the next guy. And that's an advantage we see in our business, so we try to buy the cheapest crude. However, I got to run a lot of other processes to make sure we get all that sulfur back out. Primary products, Cheyenne, we're gasoline and diesel. We try to focus all our products, gasoline, diesel, make as much as we can. That's the highest value product. Jet fuel is a high value product. We just don't have a big market for it in Cheyenne, and so we don't tailor our process to that. Other stuff, people have heard kerosene. Go buy kerosene, use it for heat. It's very similar to jet fuel. LPG, who's got a propane tank at their house? That's LPG. So we make propane up there. I've got a marketing outfit that sells propane. You go fill your tank, and that's how you heat your house. Fuel oil is the one I was saying that's that heavy piece of a crude barrel. Not a lot of spots to sell that. There's a little bit of a market, so most of that we try to run through crackers, and we're going to get into that piece and try to bring it back up in gasoline and diesel. And then the rest of it, our Tulsa plant, they make specialty waxes. So there's actually waxes that come out of a crude. They distill it down. Everybody's had a gummy bear in their life. So that nice shiny coat that's on a gummy bear comes out of crude oil. They distill it down, make a very nice paraffin wax, spray it on your gummy bear so it's nice and shiny. So the part about tasting crude oil, if you've had a gummy bear, you've all had crude oil. Coke we talked about, sulfur, and this is just another one that we don't pull out, but it's another product that can be made. Whoop. So this is the distillation piece. So in a barrel of crude, it's just this black tarry material. Doesn't look like a whole lot going on in it, right? But you take that barrel, first thing we do is run it through a crude unit. And the whole idea of a crude unit is we've got a nice tall tower. It's got 25 trays in it, and within those 25 trays you've got different temperatures on each one of those. And so all of these products, they boil out at a different temperature. And so the first stuff to come off, not very much heat, and propane comes out. Next little bit, you get to 400 degrees, and all the gasoline material's gone. And then you pull your diesels, your gas oils, to where we get all the way down to 1,000 degrees is asphalt. So asphalt, I mean, anybody's seen the guys out there with the flamethrowers, and they've got a flamethrower to asphalt? Doesn't catch on fire, right? It takes a lot of heat to get asphalt to burn. However, once it starts to burn, has anybody seen a tire fire? They burn black, nasty, hot, right? It's a lot of energy required to get that stuff to light off. And it's all about the boiling point. So this is just an indication of all the different crudes we look at the refinery. And so I showed you that base barrel. They all have a little bit different makeup. And so each of these pieces, we assign a value to each one of those layers. And that's how we value what the crude is worth to us. And then we go out and try to negotiate and buy that barrel of crude. So everybody else is trying to do the same thing in the market. That most of our crude comes down from Canada. Buy it, comes down a pipeline, lands in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and that's where we pull off, and we have our own pipeline that comes into the refinery. But this is just a makeup, and so we assign a value to all of these, and we go out and we try to buy enough crude to keep the refinery full. And this is what I was saying, so Hardisty up in Canada is where all the crude starts, and then it comes down a pipeline, goes out through Nebraska, goes all the way out to St. Louis, and stops at a big refinery in St. Louis. Our refinery, we come down through Casper, we pull off here, and our crude comes down into there. And then that same pipeline now is picking up some of the Colorado crudes and heads down to Tulsa. And this is just the feel of refinery. So anybody that has high hopes of working in a refinery, it's pretty glamorous. I recommend it. Oops. You can see there's a lot of them are focused down on the Louisiana coast. That's where I started, down in New Orleans. There's a bunch of refineries in LA, up in San Francisco. A lot of the refineries on the East Coast, though, have kind of gone away. All these refineries down here, there's 2 big pipelines that head up out of the East Coast. They get most of their products out of there because it's cheaper. They have cheaper crude down here, and these guys couldn't get competitive crude, and so they're all out of business. So did anybody hear big rains and floods they had in South Carolina, Georgia? That all wiped out this pipeline down here, and so crude was still being processed. They're still making gasoline and diesel, and New York City's running out of gasoline because they didn't have any supply. But that's all the stuff that we see, that the hurricanes down here, they've had hurricanes down here. Well, when a hurricane comes through the Gulf Coast, they start shutting down all those refineries, which is a big deal because then it takes a while to get them wound back up. But most of the middle or we call it mid-con, middle of the continent, is this piece in here is where all our refineries are. So we're kind of a niche refiner that we try to sell to little local markets. We don't try to deal with a lot of these are the bigger refineries because they're supplying bigger markets. Product specs. So this is where every spec or every product we sell has got a spec. So we've got to make sure that we make on-spec product, because if I'm not making on-spec product, I can't sell it. So then it doesn't have any value. So a lot of the regulations are EPA driven. Also the engine manufacturers, they all have specs that they're making sure that as they design their engines, that a certain type of fuel makes their engine meet all of their requirements. And we've got a lab at the refinery, so we test all our products before I can send it out. And there's a test body, ASTM, that they set a lot of the specs for what we sell our products. And this is kind of the product side of it. So from the Cheyenne refinery, that's our old Frontier sign. Now we're Holly Frontier, but you can see we sell down to the Denver market. We used to be able to sell out to Nebraska. There's not a big market out there. Or from our El Dorado refinery, they can go all the way up to Grand Forks. They go up to Minneapolis. They go over to the Chicago market, Kansas City. From Casper, those refineries can then go over to Salt Lake. But you can see that to get to the Denver market, there's pipelines coming into Denver from the south, from the north, all over to bring products into Denver to keep Denver supplied with gasoline and diesel. Key processes we're talking about. Distillation, we'll get into that. Conversion piece, cracking. So if we take gas oil and it's got a API gravity of 20, when we run it through a cracker, it takes those molecules, breaks it down into gravities of 60. Because we're taking all these long chain molecules and we're starting to break them up now into different components, because those carbon numbers are what sets those boiling points. And so we're taking a lower valued product and cracking it into something that's got a higher value to us. And then we've got the treating side. Hydrotreating, this is where we're removing, most of that's based on removing the impurities from products. So if it's sulfur primarily is what we're getting out of our products, that's what a lot of our hydrotreaters do. And then we combine the stuff back together and blend it into the finished products. So that's a very high level overview of the refinery. So this is where I was talking about, this is the very beginning of the refinery, is that distillation. I think you guys are talking about distillation.
We did a lab too.
Okay, so you guys have seen, did you use, I don't know, some kind of alcohol and water or something, or, so the alcohol, probably, I'm assuming at the lighter boiling point, I don't know what you guys use, comes off first, so this is what we're saying in distillation, right? So a big part of our business is we bring crude in, we run it through a desalter, because crude naturally is gonna have a whole bunch of chlorides, ammonium chloride salts, sodium salts. All of that is very corrosive once you go and heat it up. It'll eat through pipe in days. So we run it through a desalter, we wash all the salts out of it. We have to treat all of that, so that's a cost to go and treat water just to clean up the crude. And then from there, a big expense we have at the refinery is, big part of the refinery is we heat stuff up so we can separate it based on boiling points, and then we cool it all back off. And all that energy that we just used to heat everything up, we suck all that energy back out and then try to blend the products back up. So this temperature you can see, so we said under a distillation we heat up the crude to about 700 degrees, and then within this tower, this is where I was saying we had a whole bunch of different trays in that tower, and that's where we pull off our different products. All the light gases come off the top. This is a lot of our naphtha product. The lighter product, gasoline right now, comes off. Kerosene and diesel off the side, and then we've got a gas oil pull, and then what we call our atmospheric bottoms is all the resid, and that's all the asphalt that comes out. So just with this piece, so we've separated all the products. However, at that point, these are all very low grade products. If you go and take the naphtha, and we'll talk about this, if you just go and take that naphtha and try to burn it in your car, it's not gonna run. So just to take crude and go see somebody trying to cook crude and do it in their backyard or do some kind of still, you're not gonna get very far, because none of this stuff burns very well, doesn't do anything until you upgrade it. And then the next piece is, call it vacuum distillation. Now, this material down there, to get it to boil, how much temperature did we say we needed? 700 is the start. We set up to 1,000 degrees, right? To get that stuff to boil, to do anything, you got to get to 700 degrees. However, so some guys way back in the day said, how do I lower a boiling point? I put it under a vacuum. And right now the atmosphere is holding a pressure, so that pressure makes it harder to get something to boil. So we actually take that tower and we run it under a vacuum. If you go open up that tower, it's sucking in. And if you're sucking air into a hydrocarbon, what does that make? It makes for a very explosive mixture. Oxygen, hydrocarbon, what else do you need? A little bit of a spark, bad things happen, right? However, with that, we've got a whole bunch of safety devices set up on this tower to make sure we are monitoring for air leaks. We can measure the vacuum, but we suck a vacuum down in that tower, and then that way, that same 500 or 600 degrees, I can get asphalt to boil. So we've changed the boiling point by lowering the pressure. Cat crackers. This is one I think I saw was on the list. So there's a couple ways you can crack products. Cracking is simply taking the longer chain molecules, breaking them down into smaller chains. Gasoline range material usually has 7, 8, 9 carbon atoms. So these gas oils, they can be 20s, 30s, they can be really long chains that you take it through a cat cracker. And so the whole idea of a cat cracker is, everybody's heard the idea of what catalyst is. Catalyst tries to, it's something you add to your process. It's not a finished product, you don't take it out. but it helps you get to the finished product you want. So our catalyst in this unit is between this reactor and this regenerator. We bring the products in, they hit the catalyst forms coke on it, so then the catalyst spins back to the regenerator and comes right back to the feed, to contacts feed, so all the catalyst does is sit here and spins around in a circle. Doesn't leave. But all the gas oil we bring in, the hydrocarbon, hits the reactor. This stuff looks like baby powder, but within that baby powder there's all these little microscopic pores and sites, and within that, that's where we can drive these reactions to break up those molecules. And then same way, we kick it out to a fractionator, and the fractionator is similar to the distillation column, that once I've taken all this long chained material, I crack it down in my reactor. Now I have gasoline and diesel again, and then I make a product called slurry oil. That slurry oil comes out of the -5 gravity. Heavy stuff, can't do a lot with it. So that gets sold into a fuel oil market, because now you've cracked all those molecules down to those pieces that just will not crack and won't do anything. You've broken off all the chains, everything else, and you end up with 10% of your product that you just physically can't hardly do anything with it anymore. This is just a picture of an FCC, so even ours out there, you can see these structures are built way up in the air. We've got a whole a bunch of decks and stairways just to access, control, watch all this stuff. But we end up with our main column, the reactor sits way up in the air, and the regenerator sits down there. And the reason you've got these elevation changes are we're using gravity to help move stuff around, pressures, gravities, and make sure things are moving in the right direction. This is where I was telling you, that's the catalyst that's in there. So within these two units, I have 70 tons of catalyst circulating to make the product that we want. And then that's a picture of cyclones. So when we talk about how I recover this catalyst, I don't know if you guys ever seen a centrifuge, but essentially these cyclones cause a centrifuge effect that you sit there and you spin the oil and the catalyst around in a circle. You can spin the catalyst back out and the oil hydrocarbons moves on down. So these cyclones are how we keep the catalyst in the unit. Hydrotreating. So the idea of hydrotreating, anybody heard of it, thought of it? Hydrotreating is another way that you can change those molecules. So hydrotreating is all based up there on hydrogen, that top molecule up there on the left. So hydrotreating, we take a whole bunch of, so we get started back up. I think we have two processes to kind of go through. So we talked early on about the coker unit. So we're kind of talking crackers, what crackers do, and they take those longer chain molecules, gas oil, and break them into gasoline, diesels. So a coking unit is what I said in the winter time. You can't do anything really with asphalt other than just fill tanks. We can send it through a coking unit. And a coking unit sits there and thermally cracks stuff. So you throw it into these big drums, and I'll show you here that all it does is it sits in these big drums, it sits there and cooks on itself. And as it's cooking on itself at 900 degrees is how you crack those molecules back down into something smaller. Again, the gasoline, diesel, and gas oil range materials. And then you're left with what we call petroleum coke. So has anybody seen the trains of coal that come down through Windsor sometimes? So we make a similar product to that. We call it coke, and it ends up in the same place that it can be used for power generation. And some people use it to make different aluminum steels, or even the cement plants will use it as fuel. But that feed comes in, it's heated up to 900 degrees, and we throw it into these big drums. These drums, they'll hold 300 tons of coke when we go to cut them out, each drum. And as it sits there and slowly fills itself, it makes these little voids where the reactions are going on. It sits there and cooks itself, and then what's left over is just this bed of coke. And at the end of the day, you fill it up, and then you gotta come back and you gotta cool it off and quench it. Once you cool it off, we drill down through the middle of it, make a pilot hole, and then we sit there and we drill all this coke out, and it drops into a pit, we load it into rail cars, and it can get sent off as a product. And then we talked about reforming. That was kind of that combining idea of reforming, so we'll get into the chemistry side here in the next slide, but reforming takes a naphtha stream that doesn't have a lot of value, won't burn your car, doesn't do anything, and you can reform it into a higher value product that has a higher octane, and you can actually burn it in your car. And so it's handled with, you control that by adding heat to each one of these steps, putting it across the catalyst bed, and you can drive those different reactions, and we'll look at some of the reactions on the next page. But it's also done that as you're reforming this, now you're breaking off the hydrogen atoms, and so this process makes hydrogen that we use for the refinery. So we make some hydrogen off our reformers, and then we've got another unit that reforming process we actually make hydrogen. So you can see here's some of the chemical makeups that as we sit there and take those molecules and reform them, that base kind of 7-chain carbons coming off a crude unit. If you take that and try to burn it in your car, it doesn't do anything. So we take that, and one of the reactions that happens is you'll end up making a ring structure, breaking off all the hydrogens, and all of a sudden now you end up with a toluene that's got 111 octane. So when you sit there and look at the pumps, what are kind of the different grades you get? Get 85s, premium gasoline. Anybody look what that number is? You're filling up your car. Usually like it's like a 91 usually. So that's usually the highest that anybody needs for any motor vehicles is a 91. So this is one of the streams that's higher than that, so you use that to blend down some of the other streams. You can see even the 8-chain normal octane, it's got a negative number. And how it gets a negative number is everything's based on isooctane. So we said API gravity is kind of base 10. For octane, everything's kind of base 100. And that's run through an engine, and then you compare all these other fuels, how it runs through an engine to come up with your number. So if we run it through an engine, you end up with 2,5-dimethylhexane, and that comes up with a 95 octane. So it's improved from a minus 10, right? So that's what reforming does for us. And then as we get to the end of a catalyst life, that you actually do get into some cracking reactions can happen inside a reformer too, is that because there is hydrogen available, you can crack some of these longer chain carbon molecules, and you can end up with isopentane and methane. But we don't like that reaction because driving that all the way to methane, we're making a gas that doesn't have as much value. So these are one of the reactions that happen, but it's kind of a byproduct.
Go ahead and pause there for a second. So make sure you guys notice, you have learned, you can recognize, you know what 2,5-dimethylhexane is. Notice though, hexane has how many carbons? 6, okay? And it's part of what makes octane a higher octane. So I incorrectly, I don't know, when I said that octane always had 8. Well, that's not the correct, obviously not correct. So I'm learning something new too. I didn't know that. And also, if you would go down to even the 93 octane there, it has pentane in it, okay? And so like you said, the octane rating is based off that N-octane, which is something I didn't know, now I know. So this is what you're getting when you go to the gas station. And is this the place to talk about the difference between the winter and summer blends?
We'll do that in that other one. I think we talked about blending. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was the reformer. This is just a picture. This one's called the CCR. So this one shows fixed bed reforming, and then they also have reformers to where the catalyst actually will sit there and spin, kind of like that cat cracker. It'll sit there and spin. It's got its own regenerator, and then the hydrocarbon streams come back and forth through this heater into different parts of that bed. Steam methane reforming, we talked about another type of reforming is that different types of refining, right? Sugar refining, crude refining, there's different types of reforming. This reforming, we're taking methane. So anybody that has just natural gas come into your house, you burn it in your furnace, We take that as a feedstock, and in the presence of high pressure steam, we heat that mixture up to 2,000 degrees and run that across the catalyst bed, and then we can break all the hydrogen molecules off of that carbon. And so once we break all that hydrogen free, now that becomes hydrogen available for the other processes to use. So we're buying methane just to make hydrogen, but it makes sense because we need to have enough hydrogen to drive the processes and reactions we want. Amine treating, this is one where you don't make any extra dollars from amine treating. What happens with this is we said we wanted to run a sour crude slate because it's cheaper. So for us to run a sour crude slate, we have to be able to capture all that sour or all that sulfur from those sour streams. And the amine treating, as you crack all that sulfur off of the carbon molecules, you'll capture all that gas. You run it through an amine treater where you contact it with amine. The amine will capture all the sulfur molecules, and we end up running that through a regenerator, and then we make a stream called acid gas. It's all the concentrated sulfur gas. And then we can send off the clean fuel gas streams to the refinery to be used as fuel in the refinery. So after we recover all that acid gas, we send it through to a unit called our sulfur plant. And in the sulfur plant, we now make molten sulfur. So we take all this high H2S gas stream, heat it back up. In this process, you're burning it at 2,500 degrees and a certain chemistry makeup in there, and you can drive the reaction to where you can get elemental sulfur. And then we can cool off that sulfur. So has anybody seen elemental sulfur? A lot of times at room temperature, it's just a yellow solid. It'll look like a yellow brick. In our Kansas plant one time, they couldn't get rid of the sulfur, so they had whole mountains of just solid sulfur out there in the field until the market turned around so that they could sell that sulfur. But in our pits, we've got these pits in the ground. We can hold those pits at a couple hundred degrees, and sulfur stays a liquid, flows like water. But then once it gets cooled down, it becomes a solid. So we'll load it out into rail cars and trucks, and it heads off to the customers that we sell to. So anybody remember? So what do we use sulfur for?
Matches.
Yep, it's in matches. The other piece, kind of the bigger consumer though, than matches, is Windsor's kind of an ag community, right? So what do they use? Fertilizers. Yep. So we sell that sulfur to fertilizer companies, and then they'll manufacture fertilizer. That's what gets sold back out to the different ag companies. And this is the blending piece where we were talking about the different grades of gasoline, kind of the idea of winter, summer. So we talked about some of these processes: FCC gasoline, reformer, alkylate's one I talked to. At our refinery, we don't have an ISOM unit that takes C5s and can blend them up. And then straight run gasoline we call straight off the premium. So I was saying, if you were just to take gasoline and just run it straight off, if it has a barrel of crude oil and they want to say, I'm going to make my own gasoline, I'm just going to go boil it, make my own gasoline. Pretty hard to do, because you're going to end up with a product that, yeah, you might cook off a little bit of gasoline, but it's of such a low quality that if you try to burn it in your engine, the car won't run. But we do take part of that because it's a low octane stream, and we use that to blend up the different recipes that's required for making motor fuels. So you can see we've got this cocktail of different materials that we can use, and we've got a blender that her whole job is to make sure when the marketers are saying, hey, I want premium gasoline, or I want regular gasoline, or the different blends of, she makes sure that, hey, we're blending up all the different recipes we need, making sure we're selling all that product, and then they'll work with the marketers to make sure that, all right, we made up a whole bunch of regular gasoline. Let's make sure we can move it down the pipeline and gasoline gets to Denver. So here we're calling regular gasoline 85. Does anybody know what the octane is in Windsor for regular gasoline? Usually it says 85.
And so the reason we can have a lower regular octane value here is because we're higher in elevation. So the people down at sea level, all those customers, they need a higher octane because of the higher pressure. So what's going on is that pressure is setting the conditions that the air is coming into the engines, right? So as that air comes in, they've got a higher pressure, so they need a higher octane to get it to burn at the right spot. We've changed elevation, we're higher, so ours is gonna combust at a different spot in the engine, so we can get away with a lower octane. So we'll make an 85 octane up here. And then the part about winter and summer gasoline. So what's the air temperature in the winter? It's cooler, right? So as it's cooler, you're taking that air into the engine and trying to get that combustion to happen, right? Well, in the winter, we take butane and we put butane in there. And the reason you put butane in there, butane is what's in a lighter, right? Burns really easy. All you need is a little bit of a spark and it takes off. So we put butane in the fuels in the winter because to make sure that even with that octane, you gotta have enough vapor pressure in there with the cold air that the fuel will burn at the right temperature and the right mixture within the engine. So all winter long, we put butane in the fuels to make sure that it's burning in the right spot. And then all summer long, we're pulling butane out. We go and store it. We've got big caverns down in Oklahoma that we go and fill these caverns up all summer long until we get to the winter time, and then we put all that butane back in the gas. But that's why if you see, hey, I don't know if your dad keeps a steel gas can out in the garage and you filled it up in the winter and you try to go run it through your car in the summer and it runs like crud, right? It's because it's the wrong fuel. Depending on the season, you gotta have the right fuel. So the other part on fuel that's stored for a long time, if you do go and grab winter gasoline and let it sit there, anybody open up a gas can and all of a sudden it kind of blows all over at you? That's because it's got butanes in it, and if you're sitting there opening it at a different temperature or fill it up, all that butane is going to want to come out of that mixture because it's at a different temperature now. Different temperature, different pressure. So that's kind of the big difference between winter and summer fuels are how much butane is put into it, adjust that vapor pressure so that you can make sure you're combusting at the right time when the engine's sitting there running through its cycle. Trying to remember, how far do we go to? Do we go all the way to 9:30?
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, just making sure on my time. So that was the part about gasoline blending. So makes sense. The other thing that happens too is butane has less energy than, because this is a 4-chain carbon, right, than some of the longer chains here, that you tend to get worse gas mileage in the winter. So it's something to be aware of is during the winter when you're burning that butane, your car's going to get worse gas mileage. In the summer, it should pick up a little bit. Snapshot of the whole thing. So there's always a lot of different stuff depending on what crudes we run. Sometimes I got to have bigger units here or smaller units. So it's all tied to your crude slate as to how you configure a refinery. And this is some of the profit drivers. I've been talking about that. I don't know if it's not necessarily the chemistry side, but it's the business side. If you get into a business and everybody wants to know kind of how your business makes money, right? It's good to understand that if you're working for somebody and you want to understand how the business makes money. So the whole refinery profitability is based on, hey, we go and buy our raw materials, and that's where I was telling you we run a sour crude, high sulfur. Therefore, it's discounted, so we try to buy the cheapest fuels. We can buy some intermediate stuff, then we have to buy natural gas from the city. You have your refinery, how it's set up, and that's all the capital expenditures you put into a refinery to say, hey, based on the crudes that are available, what do you want your refinery to look like? And then this is the big piece about all the different people side of it, about what's going on inside the refinery as we try to decide what's the capacity going to be. When do we take a turnaround? A turnaround right now, every 5 years, we try to shut these units down, maintain them, go through, do our inspections so that they can run for a 5-year cycle. And if they're shutting down a whole bunch in between, we know that's not a very profitable way to run. So We've got a whole inspection group out there, and their whole job is just to make sure that they're watching all the pieces of pipe, all the equipment out there, so it doesn't fail prematurely. And then we've got the operating expenses and investment capital to try to make sure that part of your business is you have to keep investing back in your business, otherwise it's gonna fall apart, right? And then the product value, and this is where we talked about what's our product balance, what are we trying to make, what locations are we selling to, do we understand what our competitors are doing, and then what goes on winter and summer. Does anybody see what's the price of gasoline do in the summer? Usually goes up, right? A lot of that's based on demand. In the winters in Colorado, as you get further north, people just don't drive as much, and so the refineries still can make the same amount of material. Actually, they make more because you're able to blend butane in to your fuels in the winter, that as you blend this through, that those are kind of the seasonal factors. And gross profit, we talked about that. That's just another look at the dollar side. Crack spread, this is when anybody watches the news. This is a good term to hear for refineries. Crack spreads are what the business people like to go, hey, what's a crack spread? In the most basic sense, it's people that are trying to say, hey, what's just a factor of what's the business worth? They talk about a 3-2-1 spread. So 3 barrels of crude makes 2 barrels of gasoline, 1 barrel of diesel. Are the 2 barrels of gasoline and 1 of diesel worth more than the 3 crude? Because if you got a positive crack spread, just an indicator that, hey, the refineries are probably making money. Right now, our refinery down in New Mexico, their gasoline is worth nothing. So if they're buying 3 barrels of crude, gasoline's worth nothing, diesel's worth a little bit of money, what are they doing? They're dialing their refinery way back because it doesn't make sense to run crude right now. But you'll hear this one in the news sometimes, people talk. And then they get different crack spreads based on your refinery configuration. Nobody really uses that. Everybody uses kind of that 3-2-1. It's just an interesting one. If somebody says, hey, what's the crack spread? What does that mean? It just means, is a refinery profitable or not? LPs, this is for anybody big into computers. So our whole business, we've got what we call an LP, a linear program. We've got guys that their whole business is making sure that they keep the model tuned up that most reflects the refinery, so that everything we buy, we can predict what's coming out the back end of the model to say this is what the refinery is doing and is it profitable. So this is just another job within the refinery, is that we've got a whole bunch of computer controls guys controlling the process. We've got computer guys that are modeling the process, and this is what we're making all our business decisions on. Oop. And then this is RFS, and this is stuff you guys will see in the news. I know it's one that's out there. So RFS started in 2005, 2007. Does anybody know what renewable fuel standard, what do you think that would mean? Back in 2005, 2010, the government looked and said, the United States buys a lot of crude from outside the country. So all of a sudden, we're not very energy independent. So as a United States, the president and everybody in DC said, that's probably not a good spot for the country to be in. If we have to sit there and buy all of our own crude, but we buy it from somebody else, if they turn it off, what happens to the U.S.?
We fall apart.
Yeah. We don't drive, we don't move trucks, a lot of stuff happens, right, that all of a sudden we're not energy independent. So the idea was, hey, how do we make the U.S. more energy independent? Well, one of the ways they call it is renewable fuels. What's a renewable fuel? Anybody heard ethanol? So ethanol can be made from corn, can be made from other plant products, something that grows every year, it's renewable. The other one is solar energy, right? As long as the sun comes up, we got light, you can grab that, make energy out of it. So originally it was designed to make the U.S. less dependent on foreign oils, make it more energy independent. However, when we talk about what's happened is, in the government trying to force compliance, they've come up with this idea of a RIN, and this is where things kind of got muddled, is that the government, when they were trying to help force the United States to get there, well, one way to also get there is to drill more crude oil and supply our own crude. Well, that's what's happened. However, back in 2007, 10 years ago, they thought they were going to drive it by making more ethanol. Biodiesel is one they hoped was going to happen, and solar. Well, biodiesel, they put a spec out there that all the refineries got to blend biodiesel into their fuel. So where do you think all the biodiesel is made for the United States?
Iowa.
Argentina. So if it's made in Argentina, did that make the United States more energy independent? No. It drove an unintended market that the United States is saying it's not profitable here, but the government still says you got to blend it in. And so now we buy biodiesel fuel from Argentina, which totally flies in the face of what RFS was trying to do. So that's why the refiners, and you hear it, hey, EPA gets to dictate what's going on in the world. Well, we set up this program. It was a good program for the United States. We didn't want to be beholden to Venezuela for our crude oil, or Mexico, because if they've got an unstable economy. Venezuela right now, has anybody seen what's going on in Venezuela? It's unfortunate. The country's falling apart. They used to supply a whole bunch of crude oil to the United States. It's drying up. And so if we were tied to Venezuela, the U.S. would be impacted severely. But fortunately, we've been drilling our own crude, and other energy supplies have come on, so the U.S. isn't seeing that impact. But where the refineries are sitting is we're being told that we have to blend in ethanol and we have to blend in biodiesel to help drive this energy independence. But what's happened is now it's just driven a bunch of different markets to where the world now is supplying those because the U.S. isn't supplying those. So now we've drilled our own crude oil. We actually are to the point we supply enough crude oil to supply the U.S., so we're actually exporting crude oil out of the U.S. So we've hit that energy independence, but yet there's still, the government is driving us to comply with these blend standards. So right now where the refineries are at are, when we talked about profitability, I don't think I've got that, net profit. So let's see. I don't think that's got my RINs cost, but oh, there it is on top. Sorry. So this is just back to the profitability of the refinery. So if you look and say, hey, here's where we're driving to. So now when we added RINs into the equation, that I've got my cost to go buy crude oil, and then I have to pay my people, and then I have to do maintenance on the refinery, and then we're out there buying capital, and I got to pay for fuel gas and catalyst. So the RFS program took our business model that used to look like this. Now my second biggest expense in the refinery is I buy crude oil, and then I have to pay my RINs taxes. So I'm sitting here helping Argentina. I have to go buy biodiesel from Argentina. And I've got to go buy ethanol from other countries because we don't supply enough. So all these other fuel sources, I'm helping drive the world economy, but it's impacting my business. So this is where we say, hey, it's impacting the business. If the refineries went away from the United States, what's going to happen to our fuel cost?
Yeah.
It's going to go up because now instead of just buying these blend products, I got to buy everything from outside the U.S. So this is one when we say this is more of a legislative piece and doesn't necessarily tie to chemistry, but it's more the interesting piece of, hey, the government can impact people's businesses. And if the original idea in 2005, 2007, good idea. That's a bad spot for the United States to be in. However, That's why they get together every year, and we try to make new laws and review all the old laws and try to make sure any of that stuff still pertains. Well, right now, the big driver for the refineries are, we're all getting together saying, RFS, the way it was originally intended, has totally driven a different market that was unintended and isn't fair to the U.S. refineries. It's impacting our business, and we're helping out other countries. Not really what RFS was intended to do. So I know that's kind of a sidebar from the chemistry, but it's an interesting piece that, as you guys are listening to the news, hearing what the government's doing, it's good to think about, hey, are these helping U.S. businesses, hurting U.S. businesses? Well, the idea was that they thought they were helping U.S. businesses, and now things are getting out of whack and it's going the wrong way. So that was kind of my spiel. I know 43 slides, that was a lot. Any general comments, questions? So I've got one piece that I do want to kind of drive home. So the idea of the refinery, pretty much every meeting, everything we talk about is safety. So coming in and out of schools, I don't think people are thinking too much about safety, but I just saw one that happened in Eaton last night. So we talk about safety moments. They're just to get people to think a different way. So different way to think is, how many people drive? Everybody drives? How many 100% of the time wears your seatbelt? Okay, so that's a risk you're taking, right? So we talk about safety in a plant. When we're doing all these processes, high temperature, high pressure, we can accept no risk. So by taking on those pieces of risk, by not wearing a seatbelt, could be uncomfortable, whatever, kind of might take too much time. That's all a big impact that you're taking risk now to stuff we talk about. How do we mitigate risk? I was asked a question about, how many bad things happen in a refinery? What's our safety record? Well, we try to say nobody ever gets hurt in our plant, and we don't want any fires, explosions, anything. So we've got whole departments that their whole job is to make sure we talk about safety, and are we doing anything that could be even a little bit unsafe? And if it is, how do we drive that out? So the part that I just read was, last night there was an accident in Eaton, and a high school senior lost her life. So don't know about the seatbelt. Seatbelt is what I want to talk about. The piece that impacted was, who drives across the train track? Pretty much everybody in Windsor drives across the train track at some point, right? So do all of them have the gates that make you stop? No, we're still kind of an ag community, and there's a lot of railroad crossings. The piece I want to drive on safety are, seatbelts are a big deal, and you're electing not to do that. You're taking on risk that you don't need to. Same thing with racing a train. Whoever's seen a train and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't wait for 10 minutes on a train. This is going to kill me. Well, racing a train, that really can drive you there, right? So, want to make sure we talk safety a bunch in the refinery. Totally off topic, but I want you guys to think about safety. We talk about mitigating risk and things you guys can control. Put your seatbelt on. Not a big deal, right? Come up to a train crossing. Is that 10 minutes really going to impact your life? No. But if you're trying to race a train, race a car, race something, those can be lifelong impacts. Want to make sure we always talk about it. Everybody, when you show up to the school, when you leave your house, we want everybody coming back the same way that you left. So if we've got to stop, think about things, get teams together, make sure we're talking about that.
Texting is another one to talk about.
Yes,
Another big
texting on phone, that's just anything that's distracted driving, yes. But those are big ones. I just want to make sure you guys are thinking about it. Safety is a huge deal to the refinery. It's something we talk about. We want everybody's everyday life. Think about safety, because nobody wants to be lifelong impacted, or even worse, from a car accident or something that you could have controlled. easy stuff. That's all I had.
You guys have any questions at all? Because he's the expert. He can tell you what goes into your gasoline. Could you speak just for a moment about how the gas is different in the winter than it is in the summer? Because there is a
Yep.
difference.
There is a difference, and I know that, I don't know if anybody's dad, are they real penny pinchers and they watch gasoline, and hey, when I'm driving my car in the winter, I get 20 miles to the gallon, and in the summer I get 24 miles to the gallon. What the heck's going on? It must be the refineries, or it must be the cars, or it must be the something, right? Well, in the winter, because it's cooler, you're allowed to blend more butane into your car. So butane is a C4 carbon, right? Well, a C4 carbon just doesn't have as much energy, but you need that butane in there to make sure that the fuel combusts properly, because it's a lower temperature. So when you're bringing that cooler fuel into your engine, if you don't have some butane in there, it's not going to combust when it's supposed to. So in the winter, we put butanes into the fuel to make sure it burns when it's supposed to. In the summer, we take all that butane out. And all summer long, we take that butane out, and we've got big caverns in Oklahoma that we put this butane down into a well, and we fill these wells up, and then all winter long, we blend that butane back out. But there's a difference between winter and summer gasoline. So if you go and take your gas can and you fill it up in December, and then you go to open up your gas can in July, what happens? It's pressured up, takes off, you have all that butane in there. Well, that butane stays in as a liquid at 20 degrees, 40 degrees, but when it's 70 or 80, or if you put a gas can out in the sun, it gets up to 150, 200, all that butane's trying to get back out of the fuel. So you'll see there is really a difference to winter fuels, and it's specific. It makes your engine run, so you put a whole bunch of butane into it, versus summer, you take it out because the fuel's at a different temperature. So it's all about combustion in your engine. All right, thanks guys. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, but we'll see.